Why are all these companies all of a sudden going woke with this hypersexualized Marxist agenda? And why has there been a massive increase in the number of people identifying as LGBTQIA+?
They don't want to be in the news. They don't want people to talk about them. They don't want to be anywhere on the radar.
Why not?
I don't know, but I suspect it's probably because it's easier to do things when people aren't thinking about it. All of these financial institutions, they buy politicians. You can take this big ton of money, and then you can start to buy people.
Hey guys, my name's Jason Wesley, and this is not a podcast. Now, this is going to be a two-part episode, and yes, it's exhausting. Even Demi Lovato, who identified as non-binary just a couple years ago and stopped using she/her pronouns, said she's going to start using she/her pronouns again because explaining they/them to people was absolutely exhausting.
I constantly had to educate people and explain why I identified with those pronouns. It was absolutely exhausting. I just got tired.
And I can imagine it would be exhausting explaining to people the delusion using logic, reason, science, and data. There's a massive difference between tolerance, acceptance, and celebration. But those lines have been blurred in recent years, and it's not enough for you to just tolerate certain behaviors. You must accept those behaviors. And it's not enough for you to tolerate and accept certain behaviors. You must celebrate those behaviors as well. How did we go from teachers talking to kids about reading, writing, and arithmetic to teachers talking to children about masturbation?
Masturbation is really healthy, and I recommend it to people of all ages. All ages. As soon as my nephews could talk, they were doing that. That's what they were doing. Kids touch themselves. Kids start to ask questions, and we teach them the language for their bodies, right? That's your nose, touch your nose, show Aunt T, you can touch your nose. But my sister's not saying that when they're tugging at their penis, right? But it feels good, right? We have to learn ways to talk to young people about this so that they know how to explore their body.
How do we go from teachers dressing modestly in front of students to dressing like this?
Wearing enormous prosthetic breasts to work. Now, according to students, teacher Kayla Lemieux began transitioning from male to female about a year ago. Despite the outrage, school officials defended Lemieux in a letter to parents, writing, quote, Oakville Trafalgar High School recognizes the rights of students, staff, parents, guardians, and community members to equitable treatment without discrimination based upon gender identity and gender expression.
How do we go from companies like Nike just selling J's to them selling gender-inclusive clothing for kids? There's got to be a reason there's been a massive jump in people identifying as LGBTQIA+ by approximately 20% in the last few years, because apparently there's an infinite number of genders, because gender's a spectrum that no one knows where it ends or where it begins. It's like the universe.
However, gender really is more of a spectrum. So it's non-binary. There are not just two options.
Okay.
You have man, woman, and then everything that doesn't fit into just man and woman is considered non-binary. That's an umbrella term, and that includes a lot of different categorizations.
So how many genders are there?
You can't put a number on the number of genders because everyone uses different words to classify themselves.
Jesus, mothers, fathers, veterans, Memorial of Dead veterans, all get a day, but Pride gets an entire month. I'm not sure who approved that one. And our so-called president, Joe Biden, put a Pride flag up between the U.S. flag at the White House,
Which included a pride flag hanging in between two American flags in the South Lawn, actually violates the U.S. flag code. Critics point to the section that states the American flag needs to be in the center of any display featuring multiple national flags or pennants.
and the Secretary of the VA replaced a U.S. flag and put a Pride flag in its place at a veteran cemetery on Memorial Day. It's pretty much a religion now, and they are on a revival to bring in more recruits. Now, I don't have enough time to get into Marxist theory, critical theory, socialism, Common Core, or ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, in this episode, but I will touch on social reproduction theory to give you some foundation of where we're going. This is from socialistworker.org back in 2013, just after Barack Obama was elected president. We joined revolutionary organizations because we think of Marxism as an insurgent theory that fights for, but never remains satisfied with any piecemeal reform the system offers, and that calls for a complete demolition of capitalism, and is thus one of the best weapons to fight for women's liberation and gender justice. Social reproduction theory shows how the production of goods and services and the production of life are part of one integrated process. You have to understand that Marxists and socialists want to completely demolish capitalism and believe that the production of goods and the production of life is one integrated process. Now, history has taught us that it ends up ruining capitalism and ruining life, but they don't care because the ends justify the means. So there's this guy, Paulo Freire. He's a Brazilian Marxist educator that had a model of teaching educators. One of the ideas that he taught was conscientization, formation, the process of developing a critical awareness of one's social reality through reflection and action. Action is fundamental because it is the process of changing the reality. Paulo Freire says that we all acquire social myths which have a dominant tendency, and so learning is a critical process which depends upon uncovering real problems and actual needs. Marxism has permeated academia. Here's James Lindsay giving an example of how teachers are taught to teach based on Freire's teachings of conscientization.
There's actually a program by which you do that. He calls it it's very technical, codification and decodification. So you show a codified version of the political context. In other words, you tell them abstractly why things that they're looking at are political. Then you enter into what he calls a reading phase. The pun is obvious. You read the political content behind the image or the idea or the abstract presentation. Then you problematize it. So you point out why it's political. Then you point out why those politics are problematic, exactly like I just said. And then you personalize it or make it concrete to the learner to radicalize them. The idea is to actually awaken first an awareness that there's a political undercurrent to everything, as the Marxists would see it. This is what Mao called adopting the people's standpoint, by the way. Freire called his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, so we would say it's the oppressed standpoint and woke. This is adopting that perspective.
Now, there's also this thing called social emotional learning from an organization called CASEL, C-A-S-E-L, which stands for the Collaboration for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Here are the 5 core competencies of SEL that educators are taught.
Social and emotional learning is the process by which children grow and develop their emotional lives and their relationships.
Well, social and emotional learning gives the space where people can actually look at students as more than just numbers on a standardized test. We give people the space to explore who they are as people, to look at their identity, to recognize how important relationships are, and what it means to be a successful human, not just a successful student.
Wow, that looks like a list of things that parents should be talking to their kids about. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And here's an example of how the style of SEL is implemented.
Johnny is riding with his mom and dad in the car on the way to the amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They've already driven 30 miles. How much further do they have to drive? Okay, and so you think, you imagine seeing that in your children's homework. You're like, okay, who's going to object to this? Well, it turns out Freire's project is that you pick certain words and use them as generative themes to generate political conversations off of that. So a teacher being trained in this SEL method or cultural competence method or culturally relevant teaching method is going to look at that, give it to the class and say, before we answer the question, let's do this. Who's been to an amusement park before? See, now you're just getting them engaged. You're getting second graders interested. Some kids raise their hand, some kids don't. You say, well, why is it that some of you have got to go to amusement parks and some of you haven't? Why are some reasons why kids maybe wouldn't get to go to amusement parks? And you're taught in the teacher training to keep pressing until somebody says, well, maybe not everybody can afford it. Or, well, my parents won't let me. So now you're ready to have a political conversation you've generated out of the word amusement park. You've generated a political conversation about socialism, redistribution, or parental authority, which is a major theme that we're seeing now. Well, maybe some parents, should the school be making maybe some of these decisions instead? Don't you think you should be making decisions instead of your parents? Or you could go off of obviously riding in a car, you're having an environmental conversation, mom and dad, which no normal person 2 years ago would have thought mom and dad there is a trigger. But it's a generative theme, as Freire would call it. Do all families look like that, class? Does everybody have a mom and dad? No, I only have a mom. Now you're having a conversation about feminism. No, we have 2 moms. Now you're having a conversation about all the sexuality stuff. Does anybody else feel this way? Is that okay? And they are led into this equity framing or sustainability framing dialogue. And the math lesson just kind of got set over here and forgotten about. And allegedly, it's supposed to make the kids more interested in learning math lessons. So what they're being taught in education schools under the Freirean model and what they're being taught in their professional development training, as in this exact example, is this will make the kids do better in math because it'll make them want to learn math because it'll relate to the real context of their lives. And that's the sales pitch and that's the hook. But what you've actually done is hijacked a math lesson, and instead of working out that problem and maybe 10 others for practice, you've now had a 45-minute conversation about feminism in your math class and called it math.
But this is where we are. Everyone is now woke. But what is woke?
Wokeness refers to being alert to invisible injustices perpetuated against disempowered classes of people, generally defined on genetically inherited characteristics like race, gender, and sexual orientation. Basically, it borrows from the tropes of Marxism, which was this oppressor-oppressed narrative. But wokeism was not just Marxism, it was the merger of Marxism with identity politics. The idea that you are nothing more and nothing less than the genetic stock that you inherit on the day you're born.
Here's a video of pediatrician Dr. Julia Mason being interviewed talking about how her patient load has rapidly increased in recent years.
This is a thing that occurred in 2 out of 10,000 children.
Right.
It was, a thing a pediatrician could go their entire career and never see.
Yeah.
And so the first time I had a patient who told me that ever since they were 2 or 3, they knew that they were actually a boy, I was like, oh, that's transgender. I've heard of that. There's a gender clinic over at the Children's Hospital. I'll send you. And that's how it was. But then there was another one and another one and another one.
And when did that start happening?
Yeah, that was in late 2018. That was in 2018, 2019.
So one in like 10, 20 years.
One in 20 years, yeah.
And then
they started to come every few months and then more often. Yeah.
And they were not saying I've always been a boy. They were saying I realized I was a boy last week.
Most of them have been online and they know the story they need to tell. So, no, I don't think any of them said that I just decided on this last week. But they didn't have, convincing anecdotes of how this manifested in their toddlerhood.
54.8% of bisexual women engaged in exclusively straight dating behavior in the 2018 to 2021 time period. In the 2008 to 2010 period, this number was 13.3%. So this number jumped from 13% to 55%. That's quadruple the amount. So what explains the jump? Did women all of a sudden become less appealing than men and men more appealing? Or is it something else? The Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology put out a report of the rise of LGBT as a social and political identity, and here are some of the things that they found. If you notice, in 2008, 5.4% of people between the ages of 18 to 29 identified as LGBT. By 2021, that number was 16.3%. That's almost triple. Bisexuality has risen as well. Bisexuality is between 50 and 300% more prevalent among women than men. And by contrast, homosexuality is 50% to 200% more common among men than women. So women are more likely to be bisexual and men are more likely to be gay. But it's not surprising when you have a society that constantly degrades men and manliness is considered toxic. So we feminize men and consistently elevate and promote masculine women. I'm serious. Masculine women are now edified more than masculine men. And it doesn't matter if she's a biological woman or not. Even if a man identifies as a woman and beats women in women's sports, he's praised and lifted up.
She won the 500 freestyle.
Thomas wins the NCAA championship,
making history as the first transgender athlete to win a Division I national championship.
And it didn't take long to go from edifying trans people as being the first trans to do something to just calling trans women women and trans men men.
People who identify as a woman.
Identify as what?
As a woman.
What is that?
What's to each their own. Each woman, each man, each person is going to have a different relation with their own gender identity and define it differently. And so trans women are women too.
Now, I've shown this tweet before from the ACLU, but several years ago, they tweeted, trans men are men, over and over, and you get the point. Now, I'm gonna go off on a tangent for just a second. See, communism isn't about building anyone up. It's about tearing people down. Sure, communists and socialists claim that they want everyone to be equal, but what happens is you can't raise people up to greatness. You have to tear great people down. You can't make everyone a millionaire, but what you can do is you can steal from the millionaire and give it to the people who didn't do anything to earn it. In the same way, a man can never be a woman, so you have to tear down women and get them as close to a man that cosplays as a woman with surgeries, clothing, and makeup. You then have to vilify actual biological women and call them bigots for not accepting you as a woman if you're a man that believes that. You stop calling women mothers and you start calling them birthing people.
To support birthing people.
All pregnant and birthing people deserve to be treated with love. Birthing while Black should not be a death sentence.
Health equity for Black birthing people is attainable.
Mothers and babies and Black birthing people are important.
We desperately need long-term fixes to support the healthcare needs of Black women and birthing people.
It's so permeated in our society that people will literally go on Capitol Hill and testify that men can get pregnant.
Do you believe then that men can become pregnant and have abortions?
Yes.
So how is all this being pushed on society? Now, I'm going to first mention the big three, and then we're going to come back to it. So the big three are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These are asset management companies. They manage approximately 79% of all U.S. ETF assets, but they've also been losing control of their assets over the last decade. This is from Bloomberg, December 2022. While Vanguard Group, BlackRock, and State Street Global Advisors still command about 79% of all U.S. ETF assets, their combined market share has slipped for 6 straight years, Bloomberg data show. Their slice was as high as 91% in 2006. Now, what these companies are doing is they are forcing behaviors and doing things that the government can't do legally. So imagine if you're living at home with mom and dad and they control about 80% of your money. If they need you to take out the trash, wash the dishes, clean up your room, clean up the living room, they can force you by leveraging your own money against you. And before you think I'm being hyperbolic about what I'm saying, here's BlackRock CEO Larry Fink saying how he believes that corporations should collude with government to force behaviors.
You now make a point of that's an investment criteria for you.
Well, behaviors are going to have to change, and this is one thing we're asking companies. You have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors. 54% of the incoming class are women. We added 4 more points in terms of diverse employment this year, and what we're doing internally is if you don't achieve these levels of impact, your compensation could be impacted. Okay,
we're doing the same thing.
And so it's just you have to force behaviors, and if you don't force behaviors, whether it's gender or race or just any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted, and that's not recruiting, it is development, as Ken said. And ultimately, it's still going to take time, but I am just as much shocked as Ken is that we have not seen more opportunities, and we're going to have to force.
Now, I'm going to try to make this simple without getting too deep into the weeds, so please bear with me. There's this thing called corporate social responsibility, CSR, that started back in the 80s when companies started considering the impact their practices had on society and environment. They started shifting to this idea of stakeholder capitalism instead of shareholder capitalism. In shareholder capitalism, you as the head of a corporation are answerable to the people who own shares in your company and creating a profit margin. It gives you a metric of success. You need to take the interest of shareholders into account and maximizing their pursuit of making goods and services that people want and need at the highest available profit margin. In stakeholder capitalism, people that have no ownership in the company and boards of directors just ignore people who own shares, and you're only answerable to the world at large, which means you're not really answerable to anyone. You're just this benevolent dictator. And what happens is basically you have this group of elitists making decisions about what you and the company will do. This is from Time Magazine, October 2020. Now, this is a picture of Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum. A better economy is possible, but we need to reimagine capitalism to do it. By the way, reimagine is just this Marxist euphemistic buzzword. They use it a lot when they want to change policies to make it sound more appealing. Remember, they talked about reimagining policing after the death of George Floyd, who by toxicology reports suggest that he died from an overdose of fentanyl. In September, my belief that a more virtuous capitalist system is possible was reaffirmed by an initiative of the Forum's International Business Council led by Brian Moynihan of Bank of America. They released the stakeholder capitalism metrics, non-financial metrics, and disclosures that will be added on a voluntary basis to companies' annual reporting in the next 2 to 3 years, making it possible to measure their progress over time. Doing so requires answering questions such as, what is the gender pay gap in company X? How many people of diverse backgrounds were hired and promoted? What progress has the company made toward reducing its greenhouse gas emissions? How much did the company pay in taxes globally and per jurisdiction? And what did the company do to hire and train employees? Now, you see how they said on a voluntary basis? In the following years, pressure from social and climate justice movements such as Fridays for Future, inspired by Greta Thunberg, #MeToo, and Black Lives Matter added to the sense of urgency. Businesses needed to do more than make a well-intentioned vague pledge. See how you have to do more than just a vague pledge? Yeah, we'll do that. You have to do more. As Dan Bongino says on his show sometimes,
the beatings will continue until morale improves. I don't know any other way to say it.
Now, this is the end of part 1. If you want to see how all this works, go watch part 2. I'm going to leave links to the information discussed in this video in the caption, so you can look and research all of the stuff I'm talking about yourself.
Will you be mine?